Many thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this conference, and I apologize. Of course, we're all recording this at our various homes, and I live in Chicago. There is wind outside, so I will try to project my voice more to make up for this, but I apologize if it shows up in the recording. By now, most scholars, at least begrudgingly, recognize the impact that video games have had on popular perceptions of antiquity, and by extension, their continued role as gateways into the ancient world for a sizable audience. I myself got into the study of antiquity through Rome Total War when I encountered the Seleucid faction when I was a teenager. The act of translating the various cultures and historical processes of antiquity into game mechanics is, however, ultimately imperfect, similar to how our translations of ancient texts often distort their meanings, whether it is our intention to or not. This presentation aims to explore this translation process between historical polities and their representation in video games by examining the depiction of Hellenistic empires in grand strategy games and the methods afforded to the player to manage the culturally diverse populations of the ancient Mediterranean. Specifically, I'm interested in the quantification and gamification of populations and the tools through which the player can actively affect, both positively and negatively, the cultural composition of a region, and the incentivization present in these games to do so. In grand strategy games, many of these methods revolve around the construction of specific buildings that raise the presence of a certain culture while decreasing others, in effect, a zero-sum cultural mechanic. Culture is an important factor in these games, since having multiple differing cultures in a region frequently negatively affects the happiness and stability of local populations. If the player does not take pains to manage culture, either through placation or more readily available assimilation, the region may outright rebel from player control. It is this depiction of cultural interaction as a categorical, rigid, precarious system, and its subsequent promotion of monocultural assimilation for political stability that really interests me. This presentation is also not aware of the challenges in programming these game mechanics, and I recognize that it is not only difficult to gamify these cross-cultural interactions, but also that we as scholars are still debating these processes ourselves. I should also note I was initially going to cover Field of Glory Empires, but its mechanics are just slightly different enough where I would be bogged down in trying to explain them all. So I'm going to stick to the Total War series and Imperator Rome, since their mechanics overlap better and the terminology employed can be more easily switched between them. Before we dive too deeply, however, a brief introduction to the peculiarities of grand strategy games and the player's role within these games. A defining feature of the genre is its large scale. Instead of controlling a central building like a town center and commanding individual units in a small local map, the player is given command over an entire polity and can make wide-sweeping decrees, construct infrastructure, levy large numbers of troops, manage the court and family, and even alter the rate of taxation to maximize yearly income. As you can see from the clean delineated borders in this map from Imperator Rome, ancient states are given certain characteristics more aligned with our modern notion of a nation-state, a depiction meant not only to facilitate player understanding of ancient states, you can see already this problematic concession present in the way we depict ancient states on modern maps, but meant also to instill a sense of ownership and identity. Often players use the phrase "paint the map your color" to describe the player's conquest of the map, ultimately leaving it painted in a singular color of your faction. I emphasize this point because it directly shapes the player's experience and conception of the virtual ancient world as one of nations with clean delineated and defined regional provinces, and with their own qualities and populations to be conquered and managed as the player progresses. The world is compartmentalized. Within compartments or regions, these games display a host of information pertaining to many aspects like terrain and tax revenue. For our purposes, the most interesting aspect is that of the presentation of local populations through the category of culture. In many instances, culture as a game mechanic serves as a way of artificially slowing player progression. It extends the time it takes to assimilate regions by giving negative penalties if the player too quickly conquers a region with a predominant culture that is different than their own and does not stop to manage the local population. Often these penalties manifest themselves through a decline in regional public order. forcing the player to address this issue lest they face a rebellion in an ungarrisoned region as they rush forward to conquer more. You can see this in action on the screenshot to the right, with cultural differences generating the highest unrest in the region of Antioch during the first turn of a Seleucid campaign in Total War Rome 2. Developers often apply these artificial modifiers to stop the player from expanding too aggressively in the beginning of a campaign, since coding the AI to offer a challenge in these very complex games is really difficult. There are, however, states that have innate qualities to help offset ruling over different cultures, notably the Hellenistic empires. Let us now turn to their depictions. Ancient polities are frequently called factions, and the player is given a large number of choices to play in these games. Some, naturally, are more fleshed out than others, a choice based largely on which factions the developers think their player base will gravitate towards. In order to differentiate playstyles between these factions, and to attempt to capture their perceived historical realities of their governance, the developers grant them traits. Traits are inherent qualities, both negative and positive, that affect gameplay and serve to emblematize a faction. For instance, Rome might be given bonuses to their manpower and military buildings, playing on the notion that they have a heightened bellicosity, while also, coincidentally, influencing the player to pursue an expansionist path. Of course, the player still has free will and can choose to play as a pacifist Rome, but traits are nevertheless present and certainly encourage particular playstyles and influence the player perception of these factions. For the Seleucid and other Hellenistic empires, all the games featured here fixate on their interaction with other cultures. Here we have the traits for the Seleucid faction in Rome Total War 2. They and others share the successor kingdom's trait that sour diplomatic relations between Hellenistic powers, leading to more conflicts, and, interestingly, give a 50% decrease to resistance to foreign occupation in conquered territories. This means that the player will have less of a penalty to the public order in a region if the faction's culture is not the predominant one. Bactria is given a further trait titled multiculturalism, which negates any penalty to public order from the presence of foreign cultures. In Imperator Rome, the Seleucid Empire has the heritage of Seleucus, which confers happiness for cultures not integrated into the empire, and a decrease in the rate with which cultures are assimilated into the Hellenic culture group. The Ptolemaic Empire has the heritage of Ptolemy, which grants happiness if the player spreads the state Hellenic religion in Egypt, and also grants a decrease in the assimilation of other cultures. There is also a generic Hellenistic heritage trait for some factions that are not as fully realized by the developers, like Bactria and, interestingly, Parthia. Here you once more have happiness for cultural groups that are not integrated into the faction, and a negative modifier to assimilation speeds for cultures. I recognize that I have just thrown a lot of percentages and information at you, but this blitz of specifics, which we will return to throughout this presentation, is meant to show that a large theme in the conceptualization of Hellenistic empires in grand strategy games is this interaction between the governing, dominant Hellenic culture and the cultures of those whose lands these polities control. These mechanics influence the emergent narrative the player experiences. Here I employ the definition of emergent narratives written by Alexander Flegler in his chapter on Age of Empires. Quote, emergent narratives, on the other hand, are spontaneously generated by the interaction of the players with the game through its game mechanics, which can simulate historical processes. Emergent narratives can also be understood as a narrative of the game experience and be retrospectively represented by the players. This retrospectively turns gameplay into a construction of history in a historical game, and it is unique for each gameplay session. Culture is one of these mechanics that influences the emergent narrative, shaping not only the pace of player expansion, but how they govern their conquered territories to maximize their strategies and maintain provincial stability. The Hellenistic empires especially appear to be manufactured to lessen the negative penalties incurred by governing territories with different cultures. A portrait is drawn of polities that are better suited to ruling over different populations, with both games alluding to the stories of Alexander's subsumption of accumulated practices and officials as the inspiration for these traits, a rather simplistic and very Western-heavy source of inspiration, given the precedents set by the Neo-Assyrian and Achaemenid empires that ruled beforehand. Indeed, this conflation of tolerance with governance seems to also be related to the presentation of polities in these games as modern nation-states would define state religions and cultures, further creating hard boundaries between the governing culture of the player's faction and that of the populations that inhabit the regions governed. While Hellenistic empires have traits that make the ruling of these territories easier and allow the player to expand quicker, mimicking the bellicosity that defined Hellenistic monarchs as successful, the game still ultimately incentivized the purposeful cultural assimilation of territories as one of the best strategies for administrating and pacifying a region. Let us now turn to some examples of this process and the means afforded to the player to manage public order and culture in regions. There has been notable progression in the depiction of cultural differences in grand strategy games. The original Rome Total War, released in 2004 and recently remastered, limited factions to constructing buildings that were part of their perceived culture groups. For instance, if you played as the Seleucids, you could only build buildings of the Hellenic culture type. If the player took over a territory, say from Parthia with a shrine to Zoroaster present, the game then encourages the player to demolish this building and replace it with one of the 3 Hellenic temples the Seleucids are allowed to build, dedicated to either Hephaestus, Dionysus, or Asclepius, oddly enough, no Apollo. There are no specific percentages attached to culture groups within a region, but the buildings the player can construct are restricted, and buildings of other culture groups do not give the player any bonuses, so all temple buildings, which increase public order and placate populations in regions, have to be from the culture group of the player faction, a far cry from the reality that saw local forms of worship allowed to exist, in addition to the syncretism this coexistence between cultures could form. Once demolished and replaced, the population naturally is happy, and there is no attempt at depicting gradual acculturation. The population just accepts the player culture. In Rome Total War, there is no room for buildings of other cultures in the realm of the player, feeding the notion of a monolithic nation whose population conforms to the predominant culture of the player faction. Total War Rome 2 introduced a more complicated set of mechanics for the depiction of cultures in a region, but emphasis is still placed on having the player construct buildings pertaining to their own culture group. Here we have a screenshot playing as the Seleucids in the region of Syria, comprised of 4 cities, although not the tetrapolis that we're familiar with. Culture groups in the region are categorized as Hellenic, having 40%, Eastern, having 30%, and Desert Nomadic, having another 30%. Similar to Rome Total War, the player can only construct buildings of their own culture group. So for the Seleucids, Hellenic buildings. Unlike its predecessor, these buildings gradually increase the amount of Hellenic cultural domination, chipping away at other competing cultures and making the region slowly easier to govern as the populations are assimilated into the player's culture. If you recall from an earlier slide, having cultural differences in a province has one of the highest negative penalties for the player, demanding they manage it or else risk negative public order with all its negative modifiers and even a possible rebellion. As the Seleucids, the player can build a variety of Hellenic temples dedicated to more gods than in Rome Total War, but they all nevertheless promote solely the Hellenic culture. Even the vaguely named Sacred Grove building that one would imagine would be conducive to worship by a variety of religions, since ancient peoples often rationalized sacred landscapes to conform to their beliefs and lived experiences, and Hellenistic monarchs knew this. In order to create artificial challenges to the player, the developers of Rome 2 sneakily added a new factor into the game, titled Local Traditions, that would partly stymie the player's culture from growing too quickly in regions where it was not naturally present. Notice in the screenshot to the right, for the same region of Syria when playing as the Seleucids. As the base of the Seleucid faction, Syrian local traditions is actually coded to be Hellenic, and is actively adding to its influence, making sure that the region will see the Hellenic culture group rise from 40% to 44.3% in the next turn, while the desert nomadic and eastern culture groups decrease. Again, this is zero sum. While misplaced in certain regions, like Syria, the local traditions factor is an attempt to curtail a player-driven cultural monopoly in regions to artificially introduce difficulty, which also, at least superficially, acknowledges the presence of local traditions and customs and their tenacity. That being said, the player still encounters other cultures in a largely negative competitive interaction, and the game mechanics encourage the construction of buildings of the player's faction's culture. A similar emphasis on buildings as instruments of cultural assimilation is present in Imperator Rome. Buildings are, however, not largely constrained by cultural parameters. Instead, there are generic buildings like the Grand Theater and Marketplace, which simply boost the assimilation rate of populations to the player faction's state, culture, and religion. In the case of the Seleucids, this is Macedonian culture and the Hellenic religion. Imperator also allows for cultures to be integrated into the player faction, symbolizing the integration of populations into the administration and military of ancient states. These integrated cultures will not be assimilated into the state culture, and the mechanics actually allow for certain cultures to be happy in this position under player rule, aiding the stability of regions and ensuring some populations at least are placated. The presence of these integrated cultures even allows for the recruitment of culture-specific regiments like mounted archers. The player can also opt to embrace national ideas, like this one called strategic propaganda, to increase the happiness of unintegrated cultures while they work on assimilating them to the national culture. This is a more complicated and involved system than that of Total War Rome 2, but it still relies on a notion that different cultures adversely affect the stability of regions, with a relatively rigid picture of national religion and culture to boot. Culture as a game mechanic in grand strategy games is presented as a hurdle to be overcome by the player for the pacification of regions. It requires planning and management, being one of the main reasons for the player to develop infrastructure in their regions to placate the population through assimilation into their faction culture. Agency is firmly in the hands of the player as the state, and its subjects are largely passive in this relationship until they reach a certain negative threshold and just outright rebel. There is little room present for code switching, interpretation, or negotiation. I do not mean to imply that this depiction of culture was done out of malice on the part of the developers. It is simply an additional mechanic that constrains the player and attempts to at least present the varied cultural landscape of the ancient Mediterranean, albeit in a limited way. I am, however, interested in how culture as a game mechanic affects the emergent narrative of the player, and by extension, the depiction of the ancient world that results from this. We saw that emphasis is placed on religious buildings as points of conversion instead of negotiation, and as is the case in the Total War games, the player is incentivized to demolish religious buildings of another culture and replace them with their own. Hellenistic polities in these games are frequently given traits that partly curtail the negatives incurred by having different cultures present in a given region, an acknowledgement at least of historical realities. However, this translation is imperfect. It ignores that Hellenistic kings frequently participated in the established rituals of other cultures. A famous instance of this is recorded in the so-called Antiochus Cylinder, which details the restoration of the temple of Nabu, Ezida, by Antiochus I. Grand strategy games fail in showing that Hellenistic imperial ideology could be chameleonic. Even their traits only largely serve to give the player more time to manage a region. The Hellenistic period is one that is largely defined by cross-cultural communication and in many instances pervasive cultural continuity, processes that have spurred new and innovative research. That is not to say every interaction was a positive one or one that was based on equal ground. The state still held the force of arms in these instances. Nevertheless, ancient states frequently governed and legitimized themselves by appealing to local values, in granting the player centralized control over the entire ancient state, mimicking notions of national cultures and religions that we see in modern nation states. Ancient realities are lost in the translation. Video games have certainly evolved as a medium over the years, and we are seeing notable progress in depicting the cultural variety of the ancient world, but we must always keep in mind that it is not only through visuals that the ancient world gets translated for modern audiences. Game mechanics, as well as the accompanying visuals, ultimately shape the player experience and affect their view of antiquity. Culture, an already loaded term that encapsulates a variety of factors affecting one's lived experience, still struggles to be translated into the game mechanics of grand strategy games. Progress is, however, being made, and one can hope that in the future, ancient states and their interactions with subjects can be better depicted, or at least contextualized within the medium of video games. Thank you for your time and your patience, as I, still partly sick, read through this. I very much look forward to my colleagues' presentations as well.